The security camera caught everything. A pregnant woman, 8 months along, walking carefully down icy front steps. Her husband right behind her. Not beside her. Behind. Then his foot moved forward. Deliberate. Calculated. She fell face first onto frozen stone, and he just stood there, checked his phone, waited 32 seconds before calling for help. He thought he erased the footage. He thought no one would ever know. He was wrong. What happens when a wife discovers her husband has been planning her death 4 months? The insurance policy, the other pregnant woman, the water he poured on those steps. Stay until the end. This one will shock you. If stories like this move you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You do not want to miss what happens in that courtroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white. Meredith opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the brightness. White ceiling tiles, the sharp smell of antiseptic, beeping machines somewhere to her left. Her right hand moved instinctively to her belly, searching, desperate, round, firm. Still there, the baby kicked against her palm, strong and insistent. Thank God. Thank God. Mrs. Whitmore, can you hear me? A nurse leaned over her, kind face framed by graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. You have been in an accident. Do you remember what happened? Accident. The word floated through Meredith's foggy mind like something foreign. She tried to reach for the memory but found only fragments, cold air on her face, darkness, the sensation of her feet going out from under her, then nothing but black. My baby, Meredith whispered, her throat feeling like sandpaper. Is my baby okay? Your baby is perfect. Strong heartbeat, no signs of distress. The nurse smiled, adjusting the IV line. You protected her when you fell, took most of the impact on your side and shoulder. You are very lucky. Her, Meredith had known for 3 months now. A daughter. She was going to have a daughter in 6 weeks. If she survived whatever had happened to her, where is my husband? Right here. Sweetheart. Preston appeared at her bedside as if summoned. Navy cashmere sweater over a crisp white shirt, gray slacks perfectly pressed. His dark hair was styled, not a strand out of place. At 41 years old, Preston Whitmore III looked like he had stepped out of a magazine cover, not rushed to a hospital in the middle of a winter night. His hand covered hers. Cold. His hands were always cold, even in summer. You scared me, he said softly. His voice was concerned, gentle, exactly what a worried husband should sound like. But his eyes were wrong somehow, flat, watchful, like he was studying her reaction instead of feeling his own. What happened? Meredith asked. You slipped on the ice. On the front steps. Preston squeezed her hand, and she felt something unpleasant crawl up her spine. I found you unconscious. The doctors say you are lucky. 8 months pregnant, and you managed to fall without hurting the baby. My brave girl. 8 months pregnant, 32 years old, married for 5 years to the founder and CEO of Whitmore Technologies, living in a $14 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. On paper, Meredith Collins. Whitmore had everything a woman could want. So why did something feel so terribly wrong? I do not remember. She said, I do not remember falling. That is normal. The nurse made a notation on her chart. Head trauma can cause short-term memory loss. It should come back in pieces over the next few days. Try not to strain yourself. Preston nodded, serious and supportive. The perfect husband. Do not worry about remembering, sweetheart. The important thing is that you are safe. You are both safe now. But he had asked about her memory before asking if she was in pain, before asking how she felt. His first question, his very first instinct, had been to find out what she remembered about the fall. Meredith pushed the thought away. She was being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones, stress from the accident, head trauma messing with her perception. Preston loved her. He had always taken care of her. Had he not, the doctor arrived 20 minutes later. Dr. Catherine Walsh was a woman in her late 40s with steady hands and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. She had been Meredith's obstetrician throughout this pregnancy, the first one to make it past the first trimester after 3 devastating miscarriages. Well, Mrs. Whitmore, you gave us quite a scare tonight. Dr. Walsh reviewed the chart, her expression neutral, but her gaze lingering on Meredith's face a moment too long. Bruising on your right hip, shoulder, and wrist. Minor head contusion. But the baby looks perfect. Heartbeat strong. Movement normal. You are both very fortunate. When can she come home? Preston asked. His arm draped possessively over the bed rail, fingers brushing Meredith's shoulder. Tomorrow. If everything stays stable overnight. Dr. Walsh made another note without looking up. But I want to see her in my office next week for a follow-up. Bed rest for at least 7 days. No stress, no exertion. I will make sure she follows orders. Preston said. Something in his tone made Meredith's skin prickle. Not a promise. A command. Like she was a task to be managed. Not a wife to be cared for. Dr. Walsh looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to Meredith. Mrs. Whitmore, I would like to examine you privately. Standard procedure after a fall. Of course, Preston said smoothly, but he did not move from his position beside the bed. Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Walsh's voice was polite but firm. Privacy means without family members present. Hospital policy. Something flickered across Preston's face. Annoyance. Quickly masked. Of course. I will be right outside. He leaned down to kiss Meredith's forehead, his lips cold against her skin. Rest, sweetheart. I will take you home tomorrow. When the door closed behind him, the room felt different. Lighter somehow. Easier to breathe. Walsh pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, her voice dropping low. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer honestly. Can you do that? Meredith nodded, her heart beginning to beat faster. The bruising on your hip and shoulder. It is not consistent with the forward fall onto ice. The pattern suggests you were struck from behind, possibly pushed. Dr. Walsh paused, watching Meredith's face carefully. Is there anything you want to tell me about how you really ended up on those steps tonight? The fragments of memory surfaced again. Preston's voice behind her, not ahead of her, not calling out a warning about the ice. Just there, right behind her. And then the sensation of something hitting her ankle before she fell forward. No, that could not be right. She must have imagined it. I do not remember, Meredith whispered. I really do not remember what happened. Dr. Walsh studied her for a long moment, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small card. This is my personal cell phone number. If you remember anything at all, call me, day or night. I mean that. Mrs. Whitmore. Meredith took the card with trembling fingers. Why are you giving me this? Because in 30 years of practicing medicine, I have learned to recognize when something is wrong. Dr. Walsh stood, smoothing her coat, and something about tonight is very, very wrong. Rest now. But remember what I said. She left without another word, and Meredith lay alone in the harsh fluorescent light, one hand pressed against her belly where her daughter kicked and turned, the other clutching a business card like a lifeline. Something was wrong, but she could feel it in her bones, in the hollow space where her memory should be. Something had happened on those icy steps. Something more than a simple fall. And she was going to find out exactly what. Preston brought her home the next afternoon. The Whitmore estate looked like something from a luxury magazine. Fresh snow blanketing the grounds, wreaths hanging on every window, a massive tree visible through the great room windows. 23 rooms, $14 million, a prison disguised as a palace. Welcome home, Mrs. Whitmore. Eleanor Hayes met them at the door, her weathered face creased with concern. The housekeeper was 57 years old and had worked for the Whitmore family for over a decade. Her smile was warm, but her eyes flickered to Preston and then away, quick and nervous. I made your favorite soup. It is warming on the stove. Thank you, Eleanor. Meredith let Preston guide her through the marble foyer, past the sweeping staircase, toward the elevator he had installed when she became pregnant. So thoughtful. Everyone said, such a devoted husband. But now she noticed how his hand gripped her elbow, steering rather than supporting. Their bedroom was on the second floor, a massive suite with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-covered grounds, Egyptian cotton sheets, designer throw pillows, a California king bed that had never felt so cold. You need to rest, Preston said, settling her against the pillows. I have rearranged my schedule to work from home this week. I will be right down the hall if you need anything. Something in those words made her stomach clench, not comfort. A warning. Preston, she said carefully. Last night, when you found me on the steps, what time was it exactly? Around 7? His answer came too quickly, too smooth. Why I am trying to remember, trying to piece together what happened. The doctor said my memory might come back if I focus on the details. Do not strain yourself. His voice was light, but his eyes had sharpened. Watching her with that flat, assessing look. You fell on the ice, I found you, called an ambulance. That is all there is to it. But how did I fall? I have walked those steps hundreds of times. Even in winter. I am always careful. Accidents happen. Meredith, a hint of impatience now, quickly controlled. You were 8 months pregnant. Off balance? It was icy. You slipped. It is not complicated. She nodded, dropped the subject, filed away the irritation in his voice and the way his jaw had tightened when she pushed for details. I think I will sleep for a while, she said. Good. He kissed her forehead. That same cold press of lips. Rest. I mean it. The bedroom door clicked shut behind him. Meredith waited, counting his footsteps as they retreated down the hall. Only when she heard the distant sound of his study door closing did she push back the covers and swing her legs over the side of the bed. Her body ached with every movement. Her hip throbbed. Her shoulder screamed. Her head pounded with a dull, relentless pain. But she needed to move, needed to think, needed to understand why every instinct she had was screaming that something was terribly wrong. She made it to the window and looked down at the front of the house. The steps where she had fallen were visible from here. 6 stone steps leading from the circular driveway to the front door. They looked dry now, the afternoon sun warming the stone. But last night they had been slick with ice. The baby kicked hard, insistent. I know, Meredith whispered, pressing her palm against her belly. Something is wrong. I feel it too. She moved to her nightstand, reaching for her phone before remembering. Damaged in the fall. Preston had said, screen shattered. He would get her a new one. But Meredith remembered now, with sudden clarity, that her phone had been charging in the kitchen when she left the house. She had been in a hurry, rushing out to pick up something Preston said they needed from the store. She had not taken her phone with her, so how had it been damaged in the fall? She searched the room carefully, methodically. Her purse was on the dresser, emptied of everything useful. Her laptop was gone from its usual place on the desk. The landline phone that usually sat on the nightstand had been removed. Meredith walked to the bedroom door and tried the handle. It turned easily enough. She stepped into the hallway, moving quietly toward the stairs, going somewhere. She spun around, heart hammering. Preston stood in the doorway of his study, watching her with an expression she could not read. I was going to get some water, she managed. I will have Eleanor bring it up. He walked toward her, each step measured and deliberate, and you should not be walking around. Doctor's orders. Remember, his hand closed around her arm, gentle but firm, guiding her back toward the bedroom. She had no choice but to let him. Preston, where is my phone, the new one you promised? I will pick it up tomorrow. He opened the bedroom door, ushered her inside. For now, just focus on resting. I will take care of everything else. The door closed. This time, she heard a click that had not been there before. He had locked her in. Meredith stood frozen, staring at the door handle, her mind racing. She was trapped. 8 months pregnant, injured, and locked in her own bedroom by her husband. The baby kicked again, hard enough to make her gasp. I know, she whispered again. I know. We have to get out of here. But how Preston controlled everything. The security system, the staff, the finances, even her access to the outside world. She had let him take over completely. Grateful to have someone strong and capable managing things while she focused on her pregnancy. Now she realized that gratitude had been a trap. She had handed him every weapon he needed to destroy her. She walked back to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. Somewhere out there was her mother, her old friends, the life she had slowly given up piece by piece over 5 years of marriage. Somewhere out there was help. She just had to find a way to reach it. 3 days passed. 3 days of locked doors and controlled meals, and Preston's watchful presence hovering over everything. He worked from his study, appearing at regular intervals to check on her, to bring her food she did not want, to ask questions about her memory and her health that felt more like interrogations than concern. On the fourth morning, he announced he had meetings downtown that could not be rescheduled. "Eleanor will be here," he said, pulling on his coat. "She has instructions to call me immediately if you need anything. Do not try to leave the house. Meredith, you are not well enough." The warning in his words was unmistakable. She watched from the bedroom window as his black Mercedes disappeared down the long driveway. Then she waited another 30 minutes, just to be certain. The bedroom door was unlocked today. A small mercy, or perhaps just carelessness. Meredith made her way downstairs slowly, gripping the railing with both hands. Her body was healing, but every movement still hurt. She found Eleanor in the kitchen, folding linens with mechanical precision. "Mrs. Whitmore." The housekeeper looked up, startled. "You should be resting." "Eleanor, I need to use the phone. My mother. I need to call my mother." Something shifted in Eleanor's weathered face. Fear and guilt and something else. Something that looked almost like hope. "The landlines are not working," she said carefully. "Mr. Whitmore said there is a problem with the service." "Eleanor, please." Meredith stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I know you know something is wrong. I can see it in your face every time you look at me. Please help me." The older woman was silent for a long moment, her hands twisting in the dish towel she held. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, cheap cell phone. "I bought this 6 months ago," Eleanor whispered, started keeping notes, taking pictures. "I knew something was wrong, but I was scared to say anything. He pays me well, and I have grandchildren who depend on me, and I thought maybe I was imagining things." She pressed the phone into Meredith's hands. "Your mother's number is already programmed in. I found it in the old address book in the library. Go to the guest room at the end of the east wing. There are no cameras there. I disabled them months ago." Meredith stared at the phone, then at Eleanor, tears burning in her eyes. Why would you risk this for me? Because my daughter was married to a man like him." Eleanor's voice cracked. "She did not get out in time. You still can." The guest room at the end of the east wing smelled like dust and disuse. Heavy curtains blocked most of the winter light, and sheets covered the furniture like ghosts. Meredith sat on the edge of the covered bed, Eleanor's burner phone clutched in her trembling hands. She dialed her mother's number from memory. "Hello," Judith Collins's voice was cautious, wary of unknown numbers. "Mom," the word came out broken, desperate. "Mom, it is me, Mary." "Oh my God. Mary, where have you been? I have been trying to reach you for days. Preston said you needed rest and could not take calls. But I knew something was wrong. Are you okay? Is the baby okay?" "The baby is fine. I am not." And then she told her mother everything. The fall, the fragments of memory, Preston's behavior, the locked doors, the missing phones. She told her about Eleanor's secret documentation, about Dr. Walsh's warning, about the cold certainty growing in her chest that her husband had tried to kill her. When she finished, the line was silent for so long that Meredith thought the call had dropped. "Mom, I am here." Judith's voice had changed, gone hard and sharp in a way Meredith had not heard since childhood. "I am coming to get you. Right now, and you cannot. He will know. If he finds out I am suspicious, if he realizes I know something is wrong. Mom, I think he will try again. Then we need proof. We need evidence he cannot deny or explain away. The security footage. The estate has cameras everywhere. If I can access the recordings from the night I fell, I can see exactly what happened. Can you get to them? The system requires a password. I do not know it, but Eleanor might. Or Preston's head of security. Douglas Porter. He has worked here for years. If anyone knows how to access the backups, it would be him. Be careful. Mary, be very, very careful. Men like Preston, when they feel cornered, they become dangerous." "I know." "Mom," Meredith pressed her hand against her belly, feeling her daughter turn and kick. "But I do not have a choice. I have to know the truth." She hid the phone in the lining of her suitcase, in a spot she had discovered years ago when packing for a trip. Then she made her way back downstairs, careful to move slowly, to look tired and compliant and broken. Preston returned at 6, carrying flowers. White roses, her supposed favorite, chosen by him years ago without asking what she actually liked. "How are you feeling?" "Sweetheart, better." She accepted his kiss on her cheek. forced herself not to flinch. I slept most of the day. Good. He set the flowers on the counter, and she noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Barely visible, but there, he was nervous about something. We need to discuss something important. Her stomach clenched. What is it your doctor called today? About your follow-up appointment. I have arranged for her to come here instead. No need for you to leave the house while you are still recovering. He was isolating her further, cutting off any chance she might have to speak to someone outside his control. That is very thoughtful. She made herself say, thank you for taking care of everything. That is what husbands are for. They ate dinner in near silence, Preston watching her across the table with those flat, assessing eyes. When the meal was finished, he announced he had work to finish in his study and disappeared behind the locked door. Meredith waited, counted the minutes. At 10 o'clock, she heard him climb the stairs and enter their bedroom. By 10:30, his breathing had evened out into sleep. She slipped out of bed, moving through the dark house on silent feet. Preston's study was at the end of the hall, the door locked as always. But Eleanor had told her where he kept the spare key, hidden in a small drawer in the hallway table. The key turned smoothly. The door swung open. Preston's study smelled like him, leather and cedar and expensive cologne. His desk was immaculate, everything in its precise place. His laptop sat closed on the surface, the small light indicating it was in sleep mode. Meredith opened it with trembling hands. Password protected, as she expected. She tried their anniversary, his birthday, his mother's name. Access denied, access denied, access denied. Then she tried something else. His father's death date. The event that had shaped Preston's entire life, that had made him the cold, controlling man he had become. November 15th, 2008, the laptop unlocked. She navigated to his email first, scanning quickly through business correspondence and meeting requests. Nothing unusual until she searched for the name Sloan Fairchild. Dozens of results. Most of them mundane scheduling emails. But one thread, dated 3 days ago, made her blood run cold. From Preston to Sloan. She is starting to remember things, asking questions about the fall. We need to move forward with the next phase. From Sloan to Preston. The paperwork is ready on my end. How do you want to handle the timing? From Preston to soon, before she figures out too much. I will let you know when. Meredith's hands were shaking so badly she could barely scroll. She searched for insurance and found a policy she had never seen before. $8 million. Her name as the insured beneficiary, Preston Whitmore. He had taken out a life insurance policy on her 3 months ago, right after she announced the pregnancy. She searched for more, found references to a condo in Manhattan purchased 18 months ago through an LLC, found bank transfers, regular payments to someone named Sloan Fairchild, found a calendar entry from the day of her fall that read, "Make sure ice is solid by 7. He had planned it, all of it. The ice, the fall, the insurance. He had tried to murder her and their unborn baby for money. Meredith closed the laptop, backed out of the study, locked the door behind her. Her legs barely carried her to the bathroom before she collapsed over the toilet, vomiting until there was nothing left. She sat on the cold tile floor, pressing her hand against her belly where her daughter kicked frantically, responding to her distress. I am going to get us out of here, she whispered. I promise, I am going to make him pay for what he did. The next morning, she called her mother again from the hidden phone she found. I found proof, evidence of everything, but I need to get out. Mom, I need to leave today. Before he realizes I know. I have already arranged it. Judith said, I am parked 2 blocks away, behind the old church on Hillside Road. There is a path through the woods at the back of the property. Eleanor told me about it. Can you make it that far? I will make it if it kills me. She waited until noon, when Preston left for his downtown meetings and Eleanor began her usual cleaning routine on the west side of the house. Then she put on her warmest coat, stuffed the burner phone in her pocket, and walked out the back door. The path through the woods was overgrown and slippery with ice. Every step sent pain shooting through her hip and shoulder. The baby seemed to sense her urgency, holding still and quiet, as if she understood that making her mother stop to catch her breath could cost them both their lives. Meredith could see the church spire through the bare branches when she heard the sirens. She ran, stumbled, ran again, burst through the tree line just as a police cruiser pulled up behind her mother's car. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle." The officer's hand was on his weapon. "We have a report of a stolen car and a woman experiencing a psychiatric emergency." "No, no, no, no." "Meredith, get in the car." Her mother's voice was frantic. "Get in the car. Now, ma'am, do not move." The officer stepped between them. "Your husband has filed a report saying you are not mentally competent and may be a danger to yourself. We need to take you in for evaluation." Meredith looked at the officer, at her mother's terrified face, at the second cruiser pulling up behind the first. Preston had found out, and he had already destroyed her chance to escape. The psychiatric facility smelled like bleach and desperation. Meredith sat on a hard plastic chair in a room painted an aggressive shade of calming blue, her hands folded over her pregnant belly, her heart pounding against her ribs. 72-hour hold, the intake nurse had explained. Standard procedure when there are concerns about mental stability. Your husband has provided documentation from 3 psychiatrists indicating a pattern of delusional behavior. "I have never seen any psychiatrist," Meredith had protested. "Those reports are fabricated." The nurse had given her a look of practiced sympathy. "That is what everyone says. Mrs. Whitmore." Now she waited. Hours passed. A doctor came and went, asking questions designed to trap her. "Do you believe your husband is trying to harm you? Do you have evidence of this belief? Are you aware that paranoid ideation is a common symptom of pregnancy-related psychosis?" No matter what she said, it came out sounding crazy. "Yes, I believe my husband tried to kill me. Yes, I have evidence, emails on his laptop that I accessed without permission. Yes, I know how this sounds, but it is the truth." The doctor made notes, nodded sympathetically, and left her alone again. The second night, a nurse she had not seen before slipped into her room after lights out. Quiet and quick, pressing a folded piece of paper into Meredith's hand. "Your mother has not given up." She brought a lawyer. The next morning, a man in a rumpled suit appeared in the doorway of her room. "Theodore Brennan," he said, offering his hand. "Most people call me Theo. Your mother hired me to get you out of here." He was in his late 50s, with kind eyes that turned sharp when he focused, and a voice that carried the weight of too many battles fought in one. He sat down across from her and pulled out a folder thick with papers. "I have been doing this work for 30 years, Theo said, "first as a prosecutor, then in private practice. I have seen men like your husband before. Mrs. Whitmore, rich, powerful, convinced they can buy their way out of anything. They are always wrong in the end. Can you get me out?" Meredith's voice cracked. "They think I am crazy. Preston has these psychiatric evaluations, these declarations from doctors I have never even met. I have already filed motions." Theo's expression hardened. "The psychiatrists who submitted those declarations have financial ties to Whitmore Technologies. Every single one of them. It took my investigator about 4 hours to find the connections. They are being paid to say I am mentally ill. Welcome to how the other half lives." Theo closed the folder. "Your emergency hearing is scheduled for this afternoon. I cannot guarantee the outcome, but I can promise you this. I am going to fight for you like you are my own family. Because 30 years ago, I lost my sister to a man just like Preston Whitmore, and I have spent every day since making sure no one else loses theirs." The hearing was held in a small courtroom attached to the facility. Meredith sat at a table next to Theo, still wearing the thin hospital gown they had given her hair unwashed, her face pale. Across the room, Preston's legal team took up an entire row, 3 lawyers in expensive suits with predatory smiles. Preston himself was not there. Of course not. He was too busy, too important, to attend a simple hearing about his wife's sanity. "Your Honor," Theo began, "my client has no history of mental illness, no prior hospitalizations, no documented psychiatric treatment, no evidence whatsoever of the condition her husband claims she suffers from. What we do have is a pattern of financial connections between the evaluating psychiatrist and the husband's company. What we have is a pregnant woman who was forcibly removed from her mother's vehicle and involuntarily committed based on the word of a man who stands to gain $8 million if she dies." The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, listened without interruption. Preston's lawyers objected, argued, presented their fabricated documentation. But Theo had done his homework. Every lie, every connection, every piece of Preston's carefully constructed narrative. He dismantled it all. 2 hours later, the judge issued her ruling. Mrs. Whitmore is to be released immediately. This court finds no evidence of mental illness or incapacity. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into potential abuse of the psychiatric hold system. Meredith sagged against Theo's shoulder, tears streaming down her face. "It is over," she whispered. "It is finally over." Theo helped her to her feet, guiding her toward the door where her mother waited with open arms. "Not over," he said quietly. "Not yet. This was just the first battle. Mrs. Whitmore, the war is just beginning." Her mother drove her to the small house in Stamford where Meredith had grown up. Same worn furniture, same family photos on every surface, same quilt her grandmother had made draped over the back of the couch. Nothing matched. Nothing was expensive. Everything was loved. "You are safe now," Judith said, pressing a cup of tea into her daughter's hands. "He cannot reach you here, But even as she said the words, they both knew they were not entirely true. Preston had money, power, connections. He had already tried to kill her once and had nearly succeeded in having her locked away forever. A small house in Stamford was not going to stop him from trying again. "I need to see that security footage," Meredith said. "The recordings from the night I fell. If I can prove what he did, if I can show the world exactly who Preston Whitmore really is, then he cannot hurt me anymore. How the estate cameras are controlled by his security system, there might be another way." Meredith pulled out Eleanor's burner phone, scrolling through the contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Douglas Porter was Preston's head of security, had been with the family for years. But Eleanor had mentioned once that Douglas had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his employer's requests. If anyone had access to backup footage that Preston thought he had destroyed, it would be Douglas Porter. She pressed call and waited. "Mrs. Whitmore." Douglas's voice was cautious, guarded. "I heard about what happened. The psychiatric facility. I am glad you are out. Douglas, I need your help. I need to see the security recordings from December 17th. The night I fell." A long pause, then a heavy sigh. "I was wondering when you would call about that. I have copies. Mrs. Whitmore. Off-site backups that Mr. Whitmore does not know exist. I have been keeping them because I knew someday someone would need to see the truth. You have footage of what really happened. I have footage of everything." Douglas's voice dropped lower. "And believe me, Mrs. Whitmore, you are going to want to sit down before you watch it." They met at a coffee shop 3 towns over, a place where no one would recognize any of them. Douglas Porter arrived first, a tall man in his 50s with the controlled movements of someone trained in combat. He scanned the room twice before taking a seat with his back to the wall. Meredith arrived with Theo, both of them watching for any sign they had been followed. Douglas slid a USB drive across the table without preamble. "You need to understand something before you watch this." His voice was low and rough. "I served 2 tours overseas. I have seen things that most people cannot imagine. What is on this drive is not combat footage, but it haunts me just the same." "Why did you keep it?" Meredith asked. "Why not go to the police yourself?" "Because I was a coward." Douglas's jaw tightened. "Mr. Whitmore pays well. Pays for my silence, my loyalty, my willingness to look the other way. I told myself it was not my business, that whatever happened between a man and his wife was not my concern. Then I watched him try to murder you on those steps, and I knew I could not stay silent anymore." Theo took the drive, turning it over in his hands. "What exactly is on here?" 3 files. First one shows him preparing the steps about 2 hours before Mrs. Whitmore came home. Second shows him salting the staff entrance but deliberately skipping the front steps. Third shows the fall itself, and the 30 seconds he stood there, watching before he pretended to help. Meredith felt her throat constrict. He really did it. It was not my imagination, not paranoia, not pregnancy hormones. He really tried to kill me. "Yes, ma'am." Douglas met her eyes. "He really did. And if you had not survived that fall, no one would ever have known the truth." They drove back to Theo's office, a converted brownstone in downtown Hartford. The conference room had a large screen mounted on the wall, and Theo connected his laptop while Meredith sat rigid in her chair, hands pressed against her belly. "You do not have to watch this," Theo said gently. "I can review it myself, document everything." "No, Meredith shook her head. I need to see. I need to know exactly what he did. The first file opened to a grainy but clear image of the Whitmore estate's front entrance. The timestamp read December 17th, 4:47 p.m. Preston appeared from the side of the house carrying a bucket. He looked around carefully, checking over his shoulder, then slowly and methodically poured water across the front steps. Not splashing, controlled, even, covering each step evenly so the ice would form in a smooth, invisible layer. In December, Meredith whispered. In Connecticut, he was creating an ice trap. The second file showed Preston an hour later, carrying a bag of salt, but he did not spread it on the front steps. Instead, he walked to the side entrance, the path the staff used, and salted that thoroughly. He made sure Eleanor and the groundskeepers would be safe. Theo said grimly. Made sure the only dangerous path was the one he knew you would use. The third file was the worst. Meredith watched herself walk from Preston's car toward the front door, one hand pressed against her pregnant belly. She was moving carefully, aware of the cold and the darkness. Behind her, Preston followed at a distance. She saw herself grip the railing, take a careful step onto the first stair, then another. Then Preston's foot moved forward, quick and deliberate. Catching her ankle, she fell forward, arms flailing, face hitting the icy stone with a sound that made Theo flinch even through the laptop speakers. And then Preston stood there. Meredith watched herself lie motionless on the steps, 8 months pregnant, possibly dying, while her husband took out his phone and checked something on the screen, typed a message, put the phone away, looked at his watch. 32 seconds passed on the timestamp before he started shouting for help. Theo stopped the recording. The silence in the room was absolute. Meredith could not speak, could not move, could barely breathe. She had known, somewhere deep inside, that her husband had done this deliberately. But seeing it, watching him stand over her broken body and count the seconds, check his phone like he was timing an experiment, he was making sure, she finally managed to say, making sure I was not going to get back up. That is exactly what he was doing. Theo's voice was hard as stone. And now we have proof. The next 48 hours were a blur of legal filings. Theo assembled his team, a forensic accountant named Barbara Chen, and 2 junior associates who looked young enough to be Meredith's students. They worked around the clock, building a case from the footage, the financial records, Eleanor's documentation. The picture that emerged was devastating. Mr. Whitmore took out an $8 million life insurance policy on his wife 3 months ago. Barbara reported during their strategy meeting, the signature on the application appears to be a forgery. We have also found evidence of significant financial transfers to a woman named Sloan Fairchild, including the purchase of a $1.2 million condominium. His mistress, Meredith said flatly. She had suspected as much from the emails, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a knife in her chest. There is more. Barbara slid another document across the table. Ms. Fairchild is currently pregnant. 5 months along. The room went silent. Meredith stared at the paper, at the medical records that proved her husband had been planning to replace her entirely. Murder his pregnant wife, collect the insurance money, marry his pregnant mistress, raise their child with the fortune he had stolen. He was building a new life, she said slowly. A life without me in it. That appears to be the plan. Theo leaned forward, his expression grim. But here is the thing about plans, Mrs. Whitmore. They fall apart when someone starts telling the truth. They filed the criminal referral the next morning. Assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm, insurance fraud, conspiracy. The district attorney's office reviewed the footage and issued an arrest warrant within hours. That afternoon, Preston Whitmore III was taken into custody at his office, in front of his board of directors, in full view of 3 news cameras that Theo had quietly tipped off. The footage went viral by nightfall, millions of views, comment sections flooding with outrage, the hashtag Justice for Meredith trending nationwide. For the first time since the accident, Meredith allowed herself to believe it might actually be over. She was wrong. Preston made bail, $2 million, paid within hours of his arrest. His lawyers held a press conference on the courthouse steps, declaring their client's innocence and promising to fight these malicious, fabricated charges with everything at their disposal. But the real counterattack came 3 days later. Meredith woke at her mother's house to her phone buzzing relentlessly. Notifications flooding in, texts from people she had not spoken to in years. When she finally opened her social media accounts, she understood why. Her face was everywhere. Headlines screamed from every news site and gossip blog. Tech CEO's unstable wife fabricates murder plot. Sources say Meredith Whitmore has history of mental breakdowns. The gold digger who cried wolf. Leaked photos showed her looking disheveled and distressed. Images from the days after the accident when she had been locked in her bedroom, unshowered and terrified. Screenshots of text messages she had never sent portrayed her as paranoid and irrational. Former friends, people Preston had carefully cultivated over the years, were quoted describing her erratic behavior and concerning mood swings. The comment sections were brutal. She was called crazy, manipulative, a liar looking for a payout. Strangers dissected her appearance, her marriage, her motives. Some called for her to be arrested for filing a false report. Meredith sat at her mother's kitchen table, scrolling through the attacks with numb fingers. "He is destroying me," she whispered. "Even from jail. He is destroying everything." Judith took the phone gently from her hands. "These people do not know you. They do not know the truth. The truth does not matter if no one believes it." The next blow came that evening. Theo called, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Eleanor Hayes was found dead this morning. Single car accident on Route 7. The police are calling it weather-related." Meredith's legs gave out. She sank onto the couch, one hand pressed against her belly where her daughter kicked and turned. "It was not an accident." "No," Theo's pause was heavy with meaning. "I do not believe it was." She was going to testify. She had documentation, recordings, years of evidence that Preston could not explain away. And now she is dead. "Yes, he killed her." Meredith's voice cracked. "He killed her because she was helping me. We cannot prove that. Not yet. But I have hired additional security for you and your mother. And I am working with the DA to expedite the trial. Preston Whitmore is not going to get away with this, Ms. Whitmore. I promise you that." But the promises felt hollow now. Eleanor was dead. The public thought Meredith was crazy. Preston's money and power were systematically dismantling everything she had built. That night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Meredith finally broke. The tears came in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for Eleanor, who had risked everything to help her and paid with her life. She cried for her daughter, who would be born into this nightmare. She cried for herself, for the woman she had been before Preston, for all the years she had wasted believing his lies. "I cannot do this," she whispered to the darkness. "He is too strong. He has too much. I cannot beat him." The baby kicked, hard and insistent, as if in protest. "I know," Meredith said, pressing her palm against the movement. "I know you need me to keep fighting, but I do not know how much fight I have left." She lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, watching the light slowly change from black to gray to pale winter gold. Her body ached. Her heart ached worse. Everything felt impossible. And then her mother knocked on the door. "Mary, there is someone here to see you." Meredith dragged herself out of bed, pulled on a robe, and walked downstairs on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. A woman sat at the kitchen table, young, maybe late 20s, with auburn hair and anxious green eyes. She was visibly pregnant, her belly swelling beneath a designer coat that probably cost more than Judith's monthly mortgage payment. "Mrs. Whitmore." The woman stood, her hands twisting together. "My name is Sloane Fairchild. I was. I do not know what I am anymore, but I have information about your husband, and I think we need to talk." Meredith stared at her. This was the woman Preston had been sleeping with, the woman he had bought a condo for, the woman he had planned to marry after Meredith was dead. Every instinct screamed at her to throw this woman out of her mother's house. But something in Sloane's eyes stopped her. Fear. Genuine, desperate fear. "You have 5 minutes," Meredith said. "Talk fast. He told me you were abusive." Sloane's words tumbled out in a rush. "That you were mentally ill, that you trapped him with a pregnancy, that he was afraid you would hurt the baby." I believed him. I loved him, and I believed every word. And now I have seen the footage." Sloane's voice cracked. "The video of him standing over you on those steps, checking his phone while you lay there bleeding. And I realized that could be me someday. Once you were gone, Once I became inconvenient, I would be next. So you are here to save yourself. I am here because I have evidence. Sloane reached into her bag, pulled out a phone, text messages, voice recordings, conversations where he talks about you, about the insurance money, about his plans. I started recording him months ago because something felt wrong. Now I understand what I was hearing. Meredith took the phone, scrolled through the messages, saw Preston's words in black and white. Once she is handled, we can start fresh. The insurance payout will set us up for life. By this time next year, you and I will be married and no one will remember she ever existed. She looked up at Sloane, at this woman who had helped destroy her marriage, who was carrying her husband's child, who had been just as thoroughly deceived as she had been. Why should I trust you? You should not. Sloane wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You have every reason to hate me and I deserve it. But I am not going to be his next victim. Mrs. Whitmore, not me and not my baby. So I am choosing sides. And I am choosing the side that keeps us both alive. Meredith handed the phone to Theo, who had been standing silently in the doorway. Make copies of everything, she said. Then get her in front of the DA. If Preston Whitmore wants a war, he is going to get one. The days that followed felt like preparing for battle. Theo and his team worked around the clock, assembling testimony and documentation into an airtight case. Sloane's recordings were devastating, capturing Preston discussing his wife in terms that made even the hardened attorneys flinch. Combined with Douglas Porter's security footage and the forensic financial evidence, there was no reasonable doubt about what Preston Whitmore had done. But Preston was not going down without a fight. His lawyers filed motion after motion, demanding delays, challenging evidence, attempting to discredit every witness. They hired their own experts who questioned the authenticity of the footage, suggested it had been doctored or manipulated. They released statement after statement painting Preston as a devoted husband who had been railroaded by a vindictive wife and her unscrupulous attorney. The public remained divided. Social media was a war zone, with supporters on both sides trading accusations and insults. Justice for Meredith faced off against Free Preston Whitmore in comment sections and trending hashtags. Then, 3 days before the custody hearing, Theo called with news that made Meredith's blood run cold. Preston's lawyers just filed their final motion. They are claiming the security footage was fabricated by Douglas Porter as part of a conspiracy to extort the Whitmore family. They have evidence that Porter received large payments from an anonymous source in the weeks before he turned over the recordings. That is absurd. Meredith gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. Douglas was paid by Preston to keep quiet. This is all manufactured. I know that. And you know that. But a jury might not. Preston has spent millions on this defense. Mrs. Whitmore, he can make anyone look corrupt if he throws enough money at it. What do? We keep fighting. Theo's voice was steady, determined. We have Sloane's testimony. We have Dr. Walsh's medical findings. We have the financial records showing the insurance fraud. Even without Douglas's footage, we can build a case. But the footage is the proof. Without it, everything else is just circumstantial. Then we find another way to prove what happened. Meredith hung up the phone and sat in silence, her mind racing. Preston had anticipated everything, planned for every contingency, had backup plans for his backup plans. He was always 3 steps ahead, always ready to counter whatever she threw at him. But he had made one mistake. He had underestimated her. She reached for her laptop, opened social media, and began to type. The video she recorded that night was simple. Just her face, her voice, and the truth. My name is Meredith Collins. 3 months ago, my husband poured water on our front steps, waited for it to freeze, and then pushed me down those steps while I was 8 months pregnant. I have footage of what happened. Financial records showing he took out an $8 million life insurance policy on my life. Recordings of him discussing his plans with his mistress. His lawyers will tell you all of this evidence is fabricated. They will tell you I am mentally unstable, that I am making this up for money, that I am a scorned wife seeking revenge. They are lying. I am not asking you to believe me just because I say so. I am asking you to look at the evidence, to watch the footage, to read the documents, and then I am asking you to help me make sure Preston Whitmore faces justice for what he did. She posted the video before she could second-guess herself. Within an hour, it had 100,000 views. By midnight, it had crossed 1 million. By the next morning, it was the most viewed video on every platform, shared and reposted and dissected by millions of people who had never heard of Meredith Whitmore before. The tide began to turn. News outlets that had parroted Preston's PR narratives started questioning their sources. Former employees came forward with the stories of his controlling behavior and explosive temper. Women who had worked with him shared experiences of harassment and intimidation. The picture of the charming tech CEO began to crumble, revealing the monster underneath. Preston's lawyers demanded the video be taken down, citing ongoing legal proceedings. Social media companies refused. The evidence was too public now, too widespread to suppress. 2 days before the custody hearing, Meredith went into labor. It started at 3 in the morning, contractions building from mild discomfort to waves of crushing pain that left her gasping for breath. Judith drove her to the hospital, both of them silent with fear and anticipation. 12 hours later, after complications that required an emergency cesarean section, Lily Margaret Collins was born. 6 pounds, 2 ounces, perfect in every way, named for nothing except the flower Meredith had always loved, the one that grew toward the sun no matter what obstacles stood in its way. Meredith held her daughter for the first time, tears streaming down her face, exhaustion and joy and terror all tangled together. "I will protect you," she whispered against her daughter's soft hair. "No matter what happens, no matter what it costs, I will keep you safe." The hearing was scheduled for 2 days later. Meredith could barely walk, her body still healing from surgery, but she refused to postpone. "We go forward," she told Theo. "I have waited too long already. Preston is not getting one more day." February 15th dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened more snow. Meredith arrived at the courthouse in a wheelchair, her body still recovering from the emergency cesarean section that had brought Lily into the world just 48 hours before. The gallery was packed. Reporters filled every available seat, cameras documenting the proceedings for millions of viewers watching online. Supporters who had rallied to justice for Meredith held signs outside, their chants audible through the thick stone walls. A smaller group of Preston loyalists gathered across the street, though their numbers had dwindled significantly since the video went viral. Preston himself sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 4 lawyers in identical expensive suits. He looked different than she remembered. Thinner, older. The charming mask he had worn for so many years had cracked, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. Their eyes met across the courtroom. He smiled, that same confident smile he had used to win her over 6 years ago, but it did not reach his eyes. Nothing reached his eyes anymore. "All rise." The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the gallery. The Honorable Patricia Winter presiding. Judge Winters was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation for fairness, for cutting through legal theatrics to find the truth, for having zero tolerance for wealthy defendants who thought they could buy their way out of consequences. "Be seated." She reviewed the papers in front of her, then looked up at the assembled attorneys. "This is a custody hearing regarding the minor child, Lily Margaret Collins, born February 13th. However, given the serious criminal allegations underlying this matter, I will be permitting a broader scope of evidence than is typical in custody proceedings. Is that understood?" Both legal teams nodded. "Mr. Brennan, you may proceed with opening arguments." Theo stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the center of the room. He looked calm, confident, every inch the veteran prosecutor who had put away killers and con men for 3 decades. "Your Honor, what we are going to present today is a story about a man who believed his money and power put him above the law, a man who poured water on icy steps to create a death trap for his pregnant wife, a man who stood over her unconscious body for 32 seconds, checking his phone, timing her death, before pretending to call for help. We will present security footage showing this attempted murder in graphic detail. We will present financial records showing an $8 million insurance policy taken out just months before the attack. We will present testimony from the defendant's own mistress, who will describe in chilling detail his plans to eliminate his wife and start a new life with the insurance money." He paused, letting the words settle over the courtroom. Preston Whitmore III is not a devoted husband who suffered a tragic misunderstanding. He is a would-be murderer who failed only because his wife was stronger than he expected. And today, we are going to prove it. Preston's lead attorney rose for his opening. Jonathan Price was silver-haired and silver-tongued, the kind of lawyer who charged $2,000 an hour and earned every penny. He painted a picture of Preston as a successful businessman targeted by a mentally unstable wife and her opportunistic attorney. He questioned the authenticity of the footage, the credibility of the witnesses, the motives of everyone involved. But his words fell flat. The evidence was too overwhelming, the truth too clear. The prosecution called its first witness. Douglas Porter took the stand, steady and unflappable under cross-examination. He described how he had maintained off-site backups of all security footage, how he had watched Preston prepare the ice trap, how the sight of his employer standing over his unconscious, pregnant wife had finally broken through his silence. "I was a coward for too long," Douglas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I told myself it was not my business, that whatever happened between them was private. I was wrong, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." Dr. Catherine Walsh testified next, describing the bruising patterns she had observed on Meredith's body. The injuries were inconsistent with a forward fall onto ice. The contusions on her lower legs suggested she had been struck from behind, likely kicked or tripped. "In my professional medical opinion, this was not an accident." Then came Sloane Fairchild. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, visibly pregnant, her green eyes red-rimmed but determined. Preston watched her with an expression of pure hatred, his composure finally cracking for everyone to see. "Ms. Fairchild," Theo began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant?" "We were having an affair." Sloane's voice was steady, rehearsed but genuine. "It started about 2 years ago. He told me his marriage was over, that his wife was mentally unstable, that he was planning to divorce her as soon as the timing was right. And did that divorce ever happen? No. Because he did not want a divorce. He wanted her gone." Sloane paused, gathering herself. He talked about it constantly. How much easier everything would be if Meredith just disappeared. How the insurance money would set us up for life. I thought he was just venting, just frustrated. I did not understand what he was really planning until I saw the footage. What footage? The security video. The one showing him push his pregnant wife down the steps and then stand there watching while she bled. When I saw that, I knew everything he had told me was a lie. And I knew that if Meredith had not survived, I would be next. Theo played the recordings then. Preston's voice filled the courtroom, cold and calculating. "Once she is handled, we can start fresh. The insurance payout is more than enough. By this time next year, it will just be us and our baby. No more complications." The gallery erupted. Judge Winters called for order, but the damage was done. Preston's charming mask had been stripped away completely, revealing the monster underneath for everyone to see. Preston's lawyers tried to recover. They cross-examined every witness, challenged every piece of evidence, suggested elaborate conspiracies and fabricated documentation. But their efforts felt desperate now. The flailing of a drowning man grasping at straws that kept slipping through his fingers. Then came the moment that sealed Preston Whitmore's fate. Against the explicit advice of his entire legal team, Preston demanded to take the stand. Theo had expected this, had counted on it. In fact, men like Preston could not stand to be silent, could not bear to let others speak for them. Their egos demanded the last word, even when that word would destroy them. "Mr. Whitmore." Theo approached the witness stand slowly, deliberately. "You have heard the testimony presented today. Multiple witnesses, documentary evidence, recordings of your own voice. Do you deny that you planned to murder your pregnant wife?" "I deny everything." Preston's voice was controlled, but his hands gripped the arms of the witness chair. "This is a witch hunt orchestrated by a mentally unstable woman and her unethical attorney." "A witch hunt?" "I see." Theo nodded thoughtfully. "Let us talk about the security footage. The footage showing you pouring water on the front steps of your estate approximately 2 hours before your wife's fall. I was doing yard work in December in Connecticut at 5 in the evening when it was already dark. I do not remember the exact time or circumstances. The footage also shows you salting every path on your property except the front steps." "Why I ran out of salt?" Theo picked up a document from his table. "Your Tesla dashcam footage, which you apparently forgot auto-uploads to the cloud, shows a full bag of salt in your trunk after you had already finished treating the other paths." Preston's jaw tightened. "I must have overlooked it." "Overlooked it? Interesting. Let us move on. The footage shows you following your wife out of the house on the evening in question. She walks toward the front steps. You are approximately 10 feet behind her. Can you explain what happened next? She slipped. I tried to catch her, but I was too far away. Too far away. And yet the footage clearly shows your foot making contact with her ankle before she fell forward. Would you like to explain that the footage is misleading? The angle makes it look different than what actually happened. And the 32 seconds you stood over her unconscious body before calling for help, the time you spent checking your phone while your pregnant wife lay bleeding on the ice, is that footage also misleading? I was in shock. I could not believe what had happened. I was trying to process it. You were processing it. Theo's voice hardened. By typing a text message to your mistress that read, and I quote, "It is done. Call you in 20 minutes." Preston's composure finally shattered. This is insane. His voice rose, his face reddening with fury. My wife is crazy. She fell because she was clumsy and pregnant and not watching where she was going. These people, all of them, they have been paid to lie. Douglas, Sloan, even that doctor. Someone got to all of them. This is a conspiracy to destroy me, and you are all too stupid to see it. Judge Winters banged her gavel. Mr. Whitmore, you will control yourself in my courtroom. Control myself, Preston laughed, a wild sound that echoed off the marble walls. You want me to control myself while my entire life is being torn apart by lies. That woman, he pointed at Meredith, that ungrateful woman would be nothing without me. I gave her everything. The house, the clothes, the lifestyle. And this is how she repays me, by fabricating evidence and turning my own employees against me. Theo stepped back, letting Preston's outburst speak for itself. The courtroom was utterly silent. Every person watching the defendant unravel in real time. You think you have won? Preston turned to Meredith, his eyes wild with rage. You have not won anything. I have money. I have connections. I have people who owe me favors. This is not over. It will never be over. One way or another, I am going to make you pay for what you have done to me. Judge Winters slammed her gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in this court. Mr. Whitmore, you will be silent immediately or I will hold you in contempt. Preston's lawyers physically restrained him, pulling him back into his seat. The damage was already done. Every person in that courtroom, every viewer watching the live stream, every juror who would eventually hear this case, they had all witnessed the real Preston Whitmore. Not a charming CEO, not a devoted husband, just a violent, vindictive man who believed his money entitled him to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The closing arguments were brief. There was little left to say. The evidence spoke for itself, amplified by Preston's own unhinged testimony. Judge Winters announced a recess to consider her ruling. Meredith sat in the small conference room reserved for witnesses, holding Lily against her chest while her mother rubbed her shoulders. You did it, Judith said softly. You faced him and you survived. It is not over yet. Meredith kissed her daughter's soft head. Not until we hear the verdict. 2 hours later, the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. Judge Winters looked tired. The case had clearly weighed on her, the testimony and evidence painting a picture of deliberate cruelty that would disturb anyone with a conscience. I have reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this matter. She folded her hands on the bench. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case as disturbing as this one. The footage, the financial records, the testimony, they all point to a single conclusion. Preston Whitmore III deliberately created conditions intended to cause serious harm or death to his pregnant wife, then failed to render timely assistance after his plan partially succeeded. She turned to Preston, her expression hard. Mr. Whitmore, you are a danger to your wife, your daughter, and to society at large. Your behavior in this courtroom today has only reinforced that assessment. The ruling? I am granting full and sole custody of the minor child Lily Margaret Collins to her mother, Meredith Collins. Mr. Whitmore is prohibited from any contact with the child, directly or through intermediaries, until she reaches the age of 18. He is further prohibited from approaching within 1,000 feet of both mother and child, effective immediately and permanently. Regarding the financial matters, given the overwhelming evidence of fraud, forgery, and attempted murder, I am awarding 60% of all marital assets to Mrs. Collins, including her rightful share of Whitmore Technologies. The $8 million insurance policy taken out fraudulently in her name is hereby voided. She paused, her eyes meeting Preston's across the courtroom. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented today and Mr. Whitmore's threatening statements made under oath, I am revoking his bail and remanding him to custody pending criminal trial. The district attorney's office has indicated they will be pursuing charges of assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Additional charges related to the suspicious death of Eleanor Hayes are currently under investigation. The gavel came down one final time. Court is adjourned. 1 year later, the first snow of winter fell soft and silent outside the windows of Meredith's new home. It was not a mansion, not a palace, just a modest three-bedroom colonial in a quiet neighborhood where no one cared about her famous name or her infamous ex-husband. Lily sat in her high chair, watching the snowflakes drift past the window with wide-eyed wonder. At 10 months old, she had her father's dark hair, but her mother's blue eyes. A combination that sometimes made Meredith's heart ache with complicated feelings she was still learning to process. No, Lily said, pointing at the window. Her first word, and her favorite, no to vegetables, no to bedtime, no to anything that displeased her tiny majesty. That is right, baby. Meredith smiled, wiping applesauce from her daughter's chin. Snow, not no, snow. No, Lily repeated firmly. Some things, Meredith was learning, could not be controlled. And that was okay. The doorbell rang. Judith let herself in with the key Meredith had given her, stomping snow off her boots in the entryway. It is freezing out there. She hung her coat on the hook and made a beeline for her granddaughter. How is my favorite girl today? No, Lily said happily, reaching for her grandmother. We are working on vocabulary. Meredith poured coffee for them both, a ritual that had become sacred in the months since the trial ended. I saw the news this morning. Judith settled into the kitchen chair, Lily bouncing on her lap. The appeal was denied again. I know. Theo called me last night. Preston Whitmore had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. His lawyers had filed appeal after appeal, burning through millions of dollars in legal fees. But every motion was denied. The evidence was too overwhelming. His own courtroom outburst too damaging to overcome. He would be 63 when he got out. Lily would be a teenager. Meredith planned to be long gone by then, living somewhere he could never find them. How do you feel about it? Judith asked carefully. Meredith considered the question. A year ago, she would have expected to feel triumph, vindication, the satisfaction of watching her abuser face consequences for what he had done. What she actually felt was something quieter. Not happy. Exactly. Just free. I feel like it is finally over. She took a sip of her coffee, watching her daughter play with her grandmother's necklace. Like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder and start looking forward. And what does forward look like? I have been thinking about that. Meredith pulled out her laptop, opened a folder of documents she had been working on for months. Eleanor died trying to help me. She risked everything, and it cost her her life. I want to make sure her sacrifice meant something. The Eleanor Hayes Foundation. Judith read the header on the first document. What is this? Legal assistance, housing support, and counseling services for women escaping domestic violence situations, funded by my settlement from the divorce. Meredith scrolled through the business plan, the budget projections, the list of partner organizations she had already contacted. I cannot change what happened to me, Mom, but maybe I can help other women get out before it is too late. Your father would be so proud. I know. Meredith closed the laptop. I am starting to be proud too. The snow continued to fall throughout the afternoon. Judith helped make dinner, then stayed to put Lily to bed, singing the same lullabies she had sung to Meredith 30 years before. When the house was quiet, Meredith stood at the living room window, watching the white blanket cover the world outside. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at unexpected sounds, still checked the locks 3 times before bed, still felt her heart race when she saw a dark-haired man from behind. The trauma was part of her now, woven into her DNA, impossible to fully excise. But so was the strength she had discovered, the knowledge that she had faced a monster and survived, the certainty that she would never again shrink herself to fit inside someone else's expectations. The phone rang. Sloane Fairchild's name appeared on the screen. They had not become friends, exactly, too much history for that, too much pain, but they had found a strange kind of peace with each other. Two women bound together by the man who had tried to destroy them both. Hey, Sloane said, I saw the appeal news. How are you holding up? I am okay. Better than okay, actually. How is Oliver Sloane had given birth 3 months after Meredith, a son she had named for her grandfather instead of his father. She had testified against Preston at the criminal trial, her testimony helping seal his conviction, and was now raising her child as a single mother with a generous portion of guilt money she had extracted from the Whitmore family lawyers. He is perfect. Sloane's voice softened. Started crawling yesterday. Got into the cat's water bowl. They talked for a while about nothing important. Baby milestones and sleep schedules and the mundane details of single motherhood. Normal conversation. The kind Meredith had not known she was missing until she got it back. After she hung up, she walked to Lily's room and stood in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep. The past year had taught her things she never wanted to learn, about betrayal and survival and the capacity of human beings to cause unimaginable harm. But it had also taught her about strength, about resilience, about the fierce protective love that could transform a victim into a warrior. She thought about the woman she had been when she married Preston Whitmore. Young, grieving, desperate for someone to take care of her. She had been so eager to hand over control, so grateful to have someone else make the decisions, that she had not noticed the cage being built around her until the door slammed shut. That woman was gone now. In her place was someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who knew her own worth and refused to apologize for it. Sweet dreams. Baby girl. She whispered the words into the quiet darkness. Tomorrow we start again. She went to bed, pulled the covers up around her shoulders, and closed her eyes. The nightmares might come. They usually did. But so did the morning. Every single time. And in the morning, she would get up and keep fighting, keep building, keep living, not because the past did not hurt anymore, but because the future was worth every scar. Outside the window, the snow kept falling, covering everything in white, a blank page, a fresh start. Meredith Collins had survived the worst thing that could happen to a woman, and now, finally, she was ready to discover who she could become without fear holding her back. The story was not over. It never really ended. Not for survivors, not for their children, not for the ripples of trauma that spread outward through generations. But this chapter was complete, and the next one, whatever it held, she would face it on her own terms. No more cages, no more silence, no more shrinking. Just a woman, a mother, a survivor, stepping into the light,